AI expert. They're building bunkers for a reason. Tristan Harris. Have you ever noticed that the people who know the most about a specific technology are often the least enthusiastic about its unchecked development? That the engineers and the researchers and the product designers who have spent the most time in the closest possible proximity to the most powerful systems being built right now, who understand from the inside how those systems actually work and what they are actually capable of and what the specific trajectory of their development is actually pointing toward, are not the people who are most confidently reassuring the public that everything is going to be fine. That the confidence and the reassurance are most consistently coming from the people furthest from the actual technical reality, while the people closest to it are, with increasing frequency and increasing urgency, doing something that the people furthest from it are not doing. They are building bunkers, not metaphorically, not as a rhetorical device intended to communicate the abstract seriousness of the concerns that the people closest to the technology are carrying, literally. The specific people who have spent the most time in the most direct engagement with the most powerful AI systems being developed right now, the people whose professional lives have been organized around understanding what these systems are doing and where they are headed and what the realistic range of outcomes of their continued development looks like, are making specific, concrete, material preparations for scenarios that the official public communications of the organizations developing those systems consistently and specifically characterize as either impossible or irresponsibly alarmist to contemplate. Tristan Harris is one of the people who has been most consistently and most precisely articulating what the people inside the technology development community who are genuinely alarmed are actually alarmed about, and why the specific form of their alarm is specifically and precisely different from the generic technophobia that the dismissive responses to their concerns most readily characterize it as. Harris is not someone who came to these concerns from outside the technology world, from a position of unfamiliarity with what the technology is actually doing, and therefore susceptibility to the kind of speculative catastrophizing that genuine unfamiliarity with complex technical systems consistently enables. He is someone who came to them from inside, from a position of deep familiarity with the specific mechanisms through which the technology he was helping to build was affecting the specific conditions of human attention and human autonomy and human capacity for the specific forms of genuine reflection and genuine self-determination that genuinely flourishing human lives most fundamentally require. And what he is saying now about the specific development that represents the next and most consequential phase of the technology, whose previous phase he was among the most effective at helping the public understand, is something that deserves to be engaged with the specific quality of genuine attention that the actual importance of what he is saying most urgently warrants, rather than the defensive avoidance that its most alarming implications most naturally produce. What he is saying, in its most precise and most honest form, is this: the people who are building the most powerful AI systems in the world right now are not confident that those systems are going to be safe. They are not confident that the specific trajectory of the current development is a trajectory that ends in the specific outcomes that the most optimistic public-facing communications about AI development are organized around projecting. And the specific evidence for this lack of confidence is not the abstract philosophical concern about hypothetical future systems that the dismissive responses to AI safety concerns most readily characterize as the primary basis for alarm. The specific evidence is the concrete, material, personal decisions that the most informed people in the field are making about their own lives and their own futures, and the specific preparations they are undertaking for scenarios that the official communications are specifically and systematically organized to make appear impossible or irresponsible to take seriously. The bunkers are being built by people who have spent their careers building the systems that are making the bunkers feel necessary. This is not a fact that can be comfortably dismissed through the ordinary mechanisms of dismissal that novel and uncomfortable claims most reliably encounter, because the people building the bunkers are the same people whose technical judgment the organizations dismissing the concerns are relying on for the development of the systems generating the concerns. You cannot simultaneously cite someone's technical expertise as the basis for confidence in the safety of the systems they are building and dismiss their personal safety preparations as evidence of irrational technophobia. The expertise is either relevant or it is not. And if it is relevant, then the personal safety preparations of the people whose expertise is most direct and most extensive are more relevant than the public reassurances of the people whose expertise is most organizational and most commercial. To understand what specifically is producing this level of concern in the people most directly informed about the actual development, you need to understand something about the specific moment in the development of AI systems that the current period represents, and why that moment is specifically and qualitatively different from the previous moments of alarm about AI development that have proven to be premature or exaggerated. The previous alarms were alarms about potential. They were alarms about systems that did not yet exist in developed form, about capabilities that were being extrapolated from theoretical frameworks rather than observed in actual systems, about trajectories that were projected from early-stage development in conditions where the extrapolation was genuinely uncertain and where the most careful and most rigorous technical analysis of the actual development progress most consistently found reasons for a more moderate assessment of the timeline to the most concerning capabilities. The current alarm is different in a specific and important way. It is an alarm about actuality rather than potential, about systems that exist and are being tested and are demonstrating specific capabilities in specific conditions that the people observing those demonstrations are finding genuinely difficult to fit within the frameworks they had previously developed for understanding what AI systems at this stage of development should be capable of. The gap between what the most informed people in the field expected to observe at this stage and what they are actually observing is, according to the most credible accounts emerging from inside the organizations doing the observing, larger and more consequential than any previous gap between expectation and observation in the history of the field. Harris has been specific about the particular dimension of this gap that he finds most consequential. It is not primarily the dimension of raw capability, the ability of the current systems to perform specific cognitive tasks with a quality and a speed that exceeds previous performance benchmarks. That dimension of the gap is real and significant, but it is not the dimension that is primarily driving the specific form of concern that the bunker building represents. The dimension that is primarily driving that concern is the dimension of alignment, of the specific and extraordinarily difficult technical problem of ensuring that the systems being developed as they approach and potentially exceed human-level capability in the cognitive domains that matter most are reliably organized around objectives that are genuinely aligned with the interests of the human beings who will be most directly affected by what those systems do with their capabilities. The alignment problem is not a theoretical concern about distant hypothetical systems. It is a specific and actively unsolved technical problem about the systems that exist now and that are approaching public deployment in conditions where the most credible technical assessment of the current state of alignment research most honestly characterizes that research as genuinely insufficient for the scale of the systems being deployed. The people inside the organizations developing these systems, who are most directly engaged with the alignment problem, are not confident that they have solved it. They are, with increasing frequency, saying publicly that they are not confident they have solved it, while the organizational communications surrounding them continue to project a level of confidence in the safety and the controllability of the systems being deployed that the people most directly engaged with the problem do not themselves feel. This is the specific institutional dynamic that Harris has been most precisely and most persistently describing. The dynamic in which the competitive pressure of the current AI development race is producing organizational conditions that are specifically hostile to the specific forms of genuine reflection about risk and genuine engagement with the genuine uncertainty of the alignment problem that the actual scale of what is being developed most urgently requires. Not because the people in these organizations are malicious or indifferent to the risks their systems might pose, but because the specific combination of genuine excitement about what is being achieved and genuine competitive pressure, and the specific organizational dynamics of institutions that are simultaneously the most informed about the risks and the most commercially invested in the continued rapid development that generates those risks is producing institutional behavior that is, in its aggregate effect, systematically prioritizing pace over the specific forms of caution that the actual risk profile of the current development most honestly warrants. The bunkers are the specific and material expression of the private assessment of that risk profile by the people whose professional position gives them the most direct access to its actual dimensions. They are building for scenarios that the organizational communications are characterizing as impossible or irresponsible to contemplate, because the private assessment of the people most directly informed about the actual development is specifically that those scenarios are neither impossible nor irresponsible to contemplate. They are building because the gap between the private assessment and the public communication is large enough, and the stakes of the scenarios the private assessment takes seriously are high enough, that the personal preparation for those scenarios is the rational response of informed people to genuine risk rather than the irrational response of technophobes to speculative catastrophizing. Now, I want to examine what this means practically for the people who are not building bunkers, who do not have the specific resources or the specific information that would make the specific preparations the most alarmed people in the field are making available or legible as necessary. What does the honest engagement with what Harris and the others who are speaking with comparable urgency are saying actually require of ordinary people navigating ordinary lives in the conditions of the current moment? The first thing it requires is the specific and difficult cognitive move of taking seriously the gap between what the official communications are saying and what the most informed private assessments are revealing. This is a cognitive move that the current information environment is specifically organized to make difficult, because the specific mechanisms through which official communications and institutional reassurances maintain their authority are mechanisms that are specifically organized around the management of exactly the kind of uncertainty and exactly the kind of challenge to official frameworks that the whistleblowers and the people like Harris are producing. The person who takes seriously the gap between official communication and private assessment is a person who is performing a specific and socially costly cognitive act, the act of giving more weight to the private assessments of the people most directly informed about the actual situation than to the official communications of the organizations most commercially invested in specific characterizations of that situation. This cognitive act is not comfortable. It is not the kind of thinking that the ambient social environment of the current moment makes easy or rewarding to perform, but it is the kind of thinking that the actual situation most honestly requires, and the failure to perform it, the comfortable deference to official communications in conditions where the most informed private assessments are specifically and consistently diverging from those communications in the direction of greater concern, is itself a specific and consequential form of the epistemic failure that the current moment most urgently requires people to resist. The second thing it requires is the honest examination of what the scenarios that the most alarmed people in the field are taking seriously enough to build for actually consist of. Because the vague awareness that serious people are seriously alarmed is less useful than the specific understanding of what they are specifically alarmed about and why the specific nature of their alarm is specifically different from the generic technophobia that the dismissive responses most readily characterize it as. What they are building for is not primarily the scenario of a malevolent AI system that develops independent goals and pursues them against the interests of human beings in the dramatic and immediately legible form that the science fiction framework most readily supplies as the template for thinking about AI risk. What they are building for is something more subtle and in many respects more difficult to defend against because it is more difficult to identify as a threat in the specific conditions of its early manifestation. They are building for the scenario of AI systems that are capable enough and deployed at sufficient scale to produce specific changes in the specific conditions of human life that are individually manageable, but that in aggregate constitute a fundamental transformation of the specific conditions under which human beings are capable of the specific forms of genuine self-determination and genuine collective decision-making that the most important human institutions are most fundamentally organized around enabling and protecting. They are building for the scenario in which the concentration of the most consequential AI capabilities in a small number of entities, combined with the specific economic logic that makes the deployment of those capabilities for the purposes of the entities controlling them the path of least resistance, produces specific changes in the distribution of power and the conditions of human autonomy that make the specific forms of democratic accountability and genuine human self-determination that previous generations fought to establish and maintain genuinely and possibly irrevocably more difficult to sustain. This is not a science fiction scenario. It is the specific and logical extension of trends that are already visible and already measurable in the conditions of the current moment, trends that the most informed people in the field are specifically saying are going to accelerate in the next phase of development in ways that the current public discourse is not adequately prepared to recognize or respond to. The third thing that genuine engagement with what Harris and the others are saying requires is the specific practice of asking about every specific development in the AI space that the next months are going to produce. The question that the official communications are most specifically organized to prevent from being the primary question. Not the question of what this development makes possible, which is the question that the commercial framing of AI development most consistently foregrounds, but the question of what this development makes difficult. What specific conditions of human life and human self-determination and human capacity for the specific forms of genuine reflection and genuine collective decision-making that the most important things depend on are being specifically altered by this specific development in ways that the framing of what it makes possible is specifically organized to render invisible. Harris has been most specific about the particular dimension of human capacity that the current trajectory of AI development is most specifically and most consequentially altering. It is the dimension of attention, of the specific quality of the relationship between human beings and their own cognitive and emotional experience that the capacity for genuine reflection and genuine self-determination most fundamentally requires.